While the attention of the global media is fixed on Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has slipped down the list of priorities. Yet the scale of death and destruction may be greater now than ever before as Russia throws waves of young soldiers into ferocious offensives around the eastern town of Avdiivka. The Ukrainians are so far holding them back, but there's concern that Western military supplies are too few and are taking too long to arrive. War reporter David Patrikarakos is in Ukraine and joins us now to report on what's going on. David, welcome. President Zelensky was fighting against the use of the word stalemate by his military, but I'm afraid stalemate is a pretty good word to describe what's going on, isn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately it is. Since the all-out invasion of Ukraine last February, I've been in and out of the country. I've been to all three fronts. And what I'm seeing now is on the front lines very much a stalemate for various reasons. I would point out, though, that it's a stalemate in which Russia is now doing everything it can to push the Ukrainians back. I came back from the south into Kiev yesterday morning and was greeted by the biggest drone attack that Kiev has experienced since the beginning of the war. Swarms and swarms of Iranian Shahid drones attacked and struck the city. So it is a stalemate in which Russia is doing everything it can to push its advantage and to kill as many Ukrainians as possible.
Is it also the case, though, that lots of Russians are dying? I was talking there about waves of young soldiers being sent in. I mean, people now make the comparison with the trenches of the Great War. Are the Russians losing rather large numbers of inexperienced soldiers in this process?
Absolutely. Look, on the front, the Ukrainian soldiers call them meatwaves. The Russians send wave after wave of human meat, essentially. But this, Michael, as you know better than most, is the gift of autocracy. It's the gift of being a dictator. Russia can send thousands and thousands of young soldiers, young conscripts to their deaths, and there will be no blowback. Putin is not accountable to his people. No one's going to vote him out. And unfortunately, in the end, that kind of mass becomes a quality in and of itself, especially since the Ukrainians are also losing men in a democracy where every death is a political cost as well as a tragedy. So yes, the Russians are losing lots of men, but unfortunately they can afford to, and they just keep coming and coming and coming.
Let's turn to the international political situation. It appears that there is now a policy which has been dreamed up in Washington and Berlin, which is to keep the Ukrainians on a short leash, that is to say, to supply them with weapons that enable them to continue to mount a defence, but not weapons that would enable them to win a victory, with a view to taking them to the negotiating table. Is that more or less how you read it?
So I'm aware of this report doing the rounds in Berlin. There has been doubt cast on it. But look, I have to tell you again, since the beginning of the all-out invasion, delivery after delivery of weapons, it's been enough to stem the tide, to keep the Russians pushed back, but not enough to push forward and totally win the war. And it's not just the amount, it's the timing. If the Ukrainians had got what they wanted when they asked, they might have been in a better position. Look, from everything I hear on the ground and also in various capitals, European and in America that I visit, it is politically unacceptable for Zelensky to talk about negotiation. Imagine if it was a British Prime Minister. What do you do, Michael? Do you say, OK, we'll give you Manchester and Leeds? You can't say it. It's politically impermissible. But I think there is a realization that the Russians cannot be pushed out of everywhere they've occupied, especially areas they've occupied for a decade, Donetsk and Luhansk. So it's about what can you do in the interim. Right now, it's rainy. The snow hasn't yet properly fallen. It's boggy. It's hard to fight. The armor can't really move, but that will freeze. The conditions will freeze, and then we'll start to get going again in the dead of winter. But right now, I think unspoken, there is a desire for some kind of truce ceasefire to be reached. The Ukrainians are resisting with everything they can, and if we'll just see what happens when the F-16s come in, maybe something will happen. But right now, it's very much a stalemate, and everybody here is looking to the US elections. That's what they're scared of. Yes.
You made the parallel with, I think you said Manchester and Leeds. I mean, the thing that worries me is the parallel with the Munich Agreement of 1938. It's all very well, these great powers, which today are Germany, the United States, Britain, to some extent, decreeing that Ukraine should give up territory to Russia. It's not something that I feel very comfortable about, I must say.
No, I agree. Look, and I think the Munich example is quite interesting because I've said this from the very beginning. If Ukraine had folded after 3 days, as Putin's lickspittles told him it would, he would be in Moldova and Georgia by now, because why wouldn't he? There is this belief in the Kremlin, in Russia, and you see it talked about a lot, that the West is going to get bored, the West is going to lose concentration, the West will abandon Ukraine as it did Iraq, as it did Afghanistan. All they have to do is wait. And if we prove them right, that is very, very worrying. I understand people in Britain thinking, well, why should we be sending money to Ukraine, sending equipment? We need schools and hospitals. And that's completely true. But if we don't hold the line now, we're going to have to put more money in later, and that is fewer schools and hospitals. I said this, I wrote this, and I believe it to be true. There is, a Western front now that runs from Kiev, in a sense, all the way to Gaza. We have a conglomeration of enemies, Russia, China, Iran, who, to call them an axis actually is overblown. They don't have much in common, but they are united by one thing, to try and punch holes in the Western-led status quo wherever they see them. This is why the war in Ukraine is much more than just Ukraine and Russia. It really is about, I think, in key regards, the future of the West. And it is critical that after all this time and all this money and all this effort, we don't abandon them now, because it will embolden Russia and China and Iran. I promise you that.
Extraordinary, given what you say, that they're in fear of the election in the United States, because there could easily be a huge change of policy in Washington. Thank you very much, David Patrikarakos.